Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter.
ご機嫌いかがですか? Watanabe Dan desu. On today's episode of Alt Cinema, we're going to be taking a look at 3 different adaptations of the Bard's famous play, Hamlet. And why are we going to be looking at 3 adaptations of Hamlet? Not because I want to do necessarily an interpretation of how the different performances and how the different adaptations themselves were faithful or not faithful to the Bard, but also to look at how the non-above the line components of the films contributed to their overall effectiveness or lack thereof. In other words, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the cinematography, a little bit more about the production design, because those, in fact, are every bit as important as the above the line. Now, they might not necessarily be as immediately detectable by your average audience, but they feel it. And trust me, if you get the cinematography wrong, if you get the sound wrong, if you get the production design wrong, you might undermine everything else that's good about the project. And I'm going to kind of mention some other ones that follow along the same lines of the 3 exemplars that I'm going to be giving here. The first of the 3 is the 1948 version directed by Laurence Olivier. Now, this film won Best Picture, and it also won Best Actor, causing the Academy Awards to, for a moment, contemplate the thought of not allowing movies that were not made in the US to compete for that most august of awards, that this award should be only for American pictures. Fortunately, that did not pass. And unfortunately as well, because of some of the stylistics in this 1948 version, it is often criticized for the very things that I feel are the strongest about it. It doesn't help that Orson Welles, when he did Macbeth and some of his other adaptations, followed along fairly closely with some of the innovations that Olivier came out, but because Orson Welles is Orson Welles, his versions are given a lot more credit and thereby reducing the impact of the Olivier one. In fact, when you look at a lot of the current criticisms of the Olivier one, they generally focus on how old Olivier was and the fact that the movie is rather self-indulgent about, in the middle of speeches, to go off from the main characters and roam around the brooding castle of Elsinore. I'm going to actually say that rather than being a negative, that's a positive, because what it does is it locks the characters into their environment, which is something that I've noticed that no other version of Hamlet really does. They don't create the world of the kind of neo-noir, very brooding, very negative view of Elsinore and what was going on in Denmark at that time. In fact, looking at the visualization of the 1948 Hamlet, you would swear you are watching a film noir where everyone's doing a stage play, and that there's a murder that's going to happen, which in fact does happen. So it effectively tells you that you're watching something that's brooding and mysterious and haunted. There is no moment when there's brightness or happiness or any sense of contentment with any of the main characters. So the fact that it devolves into this big tragedy is not only something that's possible, but it's probable. And as for Olivier's performance, yes, he is rather stagey.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles.
But again, this has always been an issue with Olivier, whether you're looking at him in Wuthering Heights or Rebecca, or looking at him in The Betsy. He's always been rather theatrical, and the better for it, because that is his eccentricity. he perfectly exemplifies that whole idea that part of a star's appeal is as much for what they do that's kind of wrong that as for what they do that's kind of right. Yes, I'm not going to argue that he's too old for this role, but we're going to notice that every single person who plays Hamlet is too damn old for the role, except for maybe Ethan Hawke. So there's an issue there that's just germane to the telling of the story. Now, what I really found amazing about this film is some of the credits for some of its other staff and crew. The cinematographer is Desmond Dickinson, and he has an interesting career. Yes, he did a lot of the movies for Olivier, but he was also very good at doing screen adaptations of plays. For example, he helped helm Anthony Esquithe's adaptation of The Importance of Being Earnest. And when you look at that adaptation, there's certain creaky elements with it, but it's also fascinating because the world that it presents is one that is superficially bright and blingy, but we see the snobbishness in the entire enactment, and we see that carried forward in this Hamlet. Yes, the camera does roam sometimes, but it never starts roaming until it's an appropriate moment. Yes, there are times when Olivier, starting a soliloquy in voiceover, might seem a bit odd and might seem a bit twee, but it nevertheless is effective. The blocking, the lighting, and all of that contribute very much to this being a very memorable version. Interestingly enough, he also did the director of photography work on Gentlemen Marry Brunettes. Now, Gentlemen Marry Brunettes is nowhere near as good as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, but it's not a waste either. And the way he presents the girls in that, the way he shoots the women in it, is always in a position of power, which is a little bit different from the way that the cinematography was in the Marilyn Monroe Jane Russell version. It doesn't work quite as well, but we can see that this is a director of photography who has very, very good instincts. The art director is Cameron Davis, who also did The Importance of Being Earnest. And we see in the set there that there's an incredible amount of fussiness. The bric-a-brac absolutely enhances the story, such as when you have that infamous table scene where you have the two women battling each other, and they do it over cakes, over sugar, and all of that. Sugar is not seen in the best of houses anymore. You know, with lines like that, we see the obsession with prop detail, and the same in Hamlet. We see an obsession with prop detail. We're always reminded of how cavernous the castle is, how cold it is, how everybody is always isolated. There's always stairs going here, there, and everywhere. There's always rooms that are isolated, and the furniture seems to overwhelm the actors. The cinema, he also did Julia, the Jane Fonda, Vanessa Redgrave movie, where again we have this really good balance between the richness of Julia's house when she's growing up, and the beleagueredness of her as she's becomes an older woman. We also see the same thing done in Omen, where the house that Gregory Peck and Lee Remick live in is indeed a haunted house. It's not one that any of us would like to live in. Now, the Olivier version, in spite of being controversial, had a couple of very interesting follow-ups. One of them is actually perhaps my favorite version of Hamlet, which is the Russian version made in the 60s. Now this Russian version cuts the play quite a bit, but the performances in it are quite interesting, and the Hamlet portrayal in it is very much based on the Olivier one, but the actor in that has a lot more chutzpah. He seems a lot more deterministic in a way that would try to be parried by Mel Gibson in the 1990 version, and that didn't work. But in this one, his little bit more of physicality gives the narrative a sense that Hamlet Hamlet's lack of decisiveness really is a lot more toxic than it was in the Olivier version, because this is a Hamlet who could easily beat up the king and or anyone who went against him, and he chooses not to. So it's fascinating from that standpoint. Again, it's very similar to the Olivier one. In 1964, Richard Burton was all of the sensation because he did a Broadway version of Hamlet. This was 1964, so it was a very, very spectacular year on Broadway. And the Burton ticket still remained one of the hottest. Now, whether or not that's because Elizabeth Taylor was sitting in the audience most of the night, who knows? But the fact is that he brought a different sensibility to that Hamlet.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end.
Now, at the same time, there were experimentations being done of doing theatrical versions of live stage shows. And it was called electronovision, where they would shoot it with video cameras and using the same technology that they were using with the kinetoscopes, which were from the old days of live TV before either the coaxial cable or videotape, was a way of preserving those old shows. Now, it's technically very crude looking. And this Hamlet happened to have been done with the actors not in period clothes. They decided instead to do it in street clothes, and so that the text had to stand on its own. That combined with the electronovision format makes this admittedly one of the hardest ones to actually watch, because the technology gets in the way of appreciating it. But after sitting through it, one of the things we notice about it is that it does make the text stand out. It does allow us to see that some of the performances in it, particularly Hume Cronyn as Polonius, and the woman who played Gertrude, who's the same one in the Olivier version, are really, really sharp. And John Gielgud does the voice of the ghost. So here you have a great performance captured in less than ideal format. And this is one of the things that's important about watching it, because it does show you that something as basic as the cinematography in it, when not done in an ideal fashion, can in fact act as a detriment. I find this Hamlet actually to be far more fascinating to listen to than watch. Nevertheless, we should give kudos to the guy who actually did the cinematography for it. The cinematography was done by Bill Colleran, who was a big veteran of doing live shows. And in fact, if you look at the things that were designed as live and blocked for that, as opposed to being blocked for the Lint-Fontanne Theater, the way the Hamlet one was, you see that he was actually very good. In fact, he's probably someone who should be given a special award, because he shot 6 of the Judy Garland shows, particularly the ones where she was at her most insane, dealing with Mel Torme and some of the others. And we see that the choices, the switching, the actual blocking of it is actually quite good. And so he did the best he could under the circumstances. And so in reality, when you look at the 1964 Hamlet and compare it to other live television shows at the same period, such as Sidney Lumet's very acclaimed version of The Iceman Cometh, we see the same issue, that because you're shooting a performance in live time, we're capturing the event. We don't have the ability to go in for the close-ups and the other things that maximize the intimacy that you're allowed to with segmenting the way it's shot. And so you are capturing the event, and as such, it's probably as good as it's going to be. And certainly there's no way for us to recreate the actual experience of seeing Burton live. Another version of Hamlet that's similar to this is the 1980 BBC Shakespeare's Plays version. And that has Derek Jacobi, and surprisingly, the king is played by Patrick Stewart when he still had hair and when he was still more of a Royal Shakespeare actor than Picard. And so it's got all sorts of interesting things in it, especially because Jacobi would be so elemental in helping Kenneth Branagh do his first stage version and then film version of Hamlet in 1996. And that's the last of the ones that we're going to focus on intently. The 1996 Hamlet, I find to be the most disappointing version. And it's not for want of trying. I think that the biggest problem with this version is in the fact that Kenneth Branagh, the director and the actor, had gone from doing something innovative and lively and absolutely on the money, like Henry V, where he was devoted to the text, devoted to doing it correctly, devoted to still making it something that would be accessible for your average audiences, to someone who, I'm going to say it, had been corrupted by the star machine and had become a little bit too confident in himself as an auteur. And the way you see that is in the way this is enacted. It's almost like you're watching Around the World in 80 Days, because every single role is played by a major star. And in certain instances, such as Derek Jacobi as the king and Julie Christie as the queen, it's all well and good. These are great bits of casting. But then you have Jack Lemmon playing one of the sentries and Robin Williams, and you're just going, all right, now I'm getting annoyed at the guest pop-ins. I'm being thrown out of the movie. I'm being asked to play Spot the Star. And with something like Hamlet, where the text is so overwhelmingly important, to play Spot the Star undermines it. It takes away from the text. And worse than that, I'm going to say that the technical end of this Hamlet is a failure. And it's a failure not because of the way the Richard Burton one was, or perhaps the controversial nature of the Laurence Olivier one. This one is a failure almost by design, or definitely by design. First of all, the Elsinore that we see presented in this looks like it's from a Vincent Minnelli musical. It's high key lit. It's full of bric-a-brac. You swear you're watching Gigi as everyone's about to go into Maxine's. And because of that, it's too pretty. So as you're seeing Hamlet go through his angst, we're not taking it seriously, because it's as if he's Linda Evans in Dynasty. That it's not something where we're enjoying his performance or the setup. And yes, his individual performance moments are great. So is Helena Bonham Carter as Ophelia, but we're so distracted by how pretty everything is that we're distanced from it. We're not in the middle of it. What's disturbing to me about the 1996 Hamlet is that the cinematographer is Alex Thompson. And Alex Thompson had an incredibly long career. But then when you look at it more closely, you see, oh, but he's also been involved in other movies where the director figure came up with something and he either didn't have the political clout or the chutzpah to say, why are you doing that? That's nuts. He was a cinematographer on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is Richard Lester, who was coming off at that time of A Hard Day's Night, was kind of believing his own publicity, and took this play and shot it in such a disjointed way that it was almost laughable. He also did Alien 3, which at the time was a phenomenal flop. But in retrospect, a lot of people look at it and like it because they attach it to the auteurist name that came afterwards of David Fincher. So yeah, he's someone who's had some interesting things. Although I got to tell you, my favorite of all of his movies is probably Dr. Phibes Rides Again, because in this cheaper movie, in this cheap genre picture, you actually see innovation. So I just wish that that same kind of energy in the cinematography and the lighting and all of that was as fun as it was in that movie. The production designer is Tim Harvey, who did a whole bunch of the other Branagh movies. So they obviously are a team. And so I'm surprised that this one didn't come out better. Although maybe we can see the signs of trouble in the fact that he also shot Frankenstein, which spends entirely too much time showcasing how sexy Branagh is with his Nautilus-sized body, which is kind of a mistake. He shouldn't have done that. But look at Henry V. Look at Dead Again. These are movies where the production design is spot on. The art director is Desmond Crowe. Now, Desmond Crowe is very much an old school studio type guy who has a wide variety of different types of productions under his belt, including things that were admittedly somewhat challenging, like Not Without My Daughter, where Sally Field finds herself sent to Iran to be with her husband, and she has to do an escape. Shot almost like a TV movie, but the ability to actually get the sense of the different cultures of the culture in Iran versus the culture in the United States. It's actually quite good in that, and even if it's done on clearly a lower budget, the fact that he knows what to not have in the image was good, which is what's surprising about the art direction in Hamlet, which is altogether too crowded. And unfortunately, he also has some bad movies that are beautifully designed in it, such as 1992's Shining Through, which had Melanie Griffith and Kirk Douglas in it in this adaptation of Susan Isaac's novel. The production design in that is immaculate because all of the characters are defined by their setting in an extremely good way. So we know that he's actually got it in him when probably he was left alone. So I gotta say, again, with this Hamlet, the people involved have the credentials. Why is it that it looks like something Mike Todd would have done in the 50s as opposed to a Shakespeare adaptation? Plus, Branagh's attempt to do the entire play rather than as in every other version cutting it down rather drastically, it allows the long R's to creep in. And yes, it's great if you're in English class and you can watch this instead of reading the play. And then certainly, like I said, most of the interpretations are fine. You're just distracted by the star power.
To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more.
This is the first Hamlet that I saw where I didn't feel the least bit of suspense. I didn't feel the least bit of the danger. I didn't feel that there was enough there to make me want to keep watching it. Now, this certainly isn't the only demented version of Hamlet that had ever been done. Certainly, you can look at the Mel Gibson version of 1990, which was the first of the Zeffirelli adaptations of Shakespeare that I have to honestly say I had nothing good to say about it. It's interesting in a, well, I guess you could do it that way, but it reminded me of The Goodbye Girl, where Richard Dreyfuss, as an actor, has to put up with an insane director who wants to do a bad version of Richard III, and he ends up being a failure in it. That's what I felt about that version. It's elaborate, it looks beautiful, it's got an interesting Glenn Close performance, but it's so wrong that all you can do is look at it and say, wow, okay, do you. There's also the Nicole Williamson version of the late 60s that was directed by Tony Richardson, which is sort of the Cliff Notes version of Hamlet. It's less than 2 hours, so it goes by like that. And it's cut so much that you feel the entire time you're watching it that you should be watching a movie that's at least an hour longer and that it's been severely cut. And that's a shame because Nicole Williamson does a very interesting interpretation of Hamlet. I also tend to like the newer version with Ethan Hawke. Yes, the setup is outrageous. The modern dress is a bit odd. The actors aren't quite up to the text, but it's an interesting interpretation. It's valid, as is the Japanese version of The Bad Sleep Well. Waru Yatsu Hodo Yoku Nemureru, the Kurosawa movie. You notice that when people talk about Kurosawa's adaptations of Shakespeare, they don't mention that one. Okay, for whatever reason. Anyway, so as we see, looking at something like Hamlet, where you're using the exact same text, the way it is put together is vitally important to whether or not it is ultimately effective. And that's why we love the movies, because there's always something new to discover.
Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew